Hello, I'm Rick Wade, Senior Vice President for Strategic Alliances and Outreach here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us for this very important conversation as we kind of walk the road to racial equality and equity. You know, a couple of years ago, the U.S. Chamber launched a historic private sector-led initiative, the Equality of Opportunity Initiative, which is about addressing the policies, as well as launching and advancing and supporting private sector initiatives that address and close the race-based inequalities in the United States of America. This is a really important dialogue, difficult work. Yes, it is, but work that must be done nonetheless. And we look forward to engaging two very distinguished individuals to talk about this road to racial equality. Joining us this afternoon, Crystal Barnes, Senior Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility and Environmental, Social, and Governance at ViacomCBS, and Gawain Patterson, Senior Vice President, Action for Racial Equity at Citi. Thanks both of you for joining me in this very important conversation.
For having us.
Thanks, Rick.
Crystal, let's start with you. What a wonderful segue coming from and seeing my good friend Janine talk about content for change. Tell us a bit more about that, because I think one of the things that she mentioned was the power of storytelling. So give us a little bit more insight about the work at ViacomCBS and more specifically Content for Change.
So I would love to. And again, thank you for having me. Just to take a step back, one of the things that we are really excited about and committed to is using and leveraging the power of one of the largest content creators for good. And so for us, that means that we understand that we have the ability to positively influence social impact outcomes, as well as stories. And in that, there's a responsibility to leverage our content. There's a responsibility to leverage our reach. There's a responsibility to leverage our platforms in order to shape the values and the perceptions that we know shift cultural change, right? And so that's what Content for Change is all about. It's about leaning into research and insights in rigor across three areas that we know will help us to create a big shift across our content. So evolving the stories that we tell across ViacomCBS, across our creative supply chain, which supports that content, and ensuring that we are, infusing equity into that entire content pipeline. And then about the culture. So that's our internal culture. It underpins everything that we do, in addition to infusing access to opportunity and having accountability for that within, our cultural space. And so in doing all of these, the hope is that we're able to combat racism, bias, stereotype, and all forms of hate that exist both on and off screen. And so that's really, as Janine said, it started with BET in 2020, and very quickly we realized that there was an opportunity to expand it across the organization. And so that's what we did last month. And it really does lead our accountability journey in this space.
Again, I think you're right. The storytelling and the power of that is just absolutely impactful. I'm just curious, before we go over to Gawain, why is it when I guess it's one thing to have the conversation about race in America, and it's tough, but when you put a face on it, what's the outcome of the storytelling? To help us understand what about each other?
Yeah, so the outcome of the storytelling is to tell true and diverse stories of the audiences that we represent and deliver content to every day, right? And we do, as a company, we do have a legacy of telling very diverse stories. However, we also know that there's an opportunity to bump that up a notch so that we can see the truth and the real in each other, right? And we have, at ViacomCBS, we have from BET to Nickelodeon to CBS to MTV. We have a ton of diverse networks underneath our umbrella. And so we do have an opportunity to tell stories, to tell them appropriately, to tell them accurately, and to tell them diversely so that we can see ourselves and each other reflected in the content that we serve.
Yeah, thank you. Gawain, you at Citi, you launched, I guess, a very comprehensive, incredible, impactful initiative and work that you're leading around Citi's Action for Racial Equity. Tell us more about that and how that came to be.
Thanks, Rick. Absolutely. And again, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about what Citi's doing and also hear about the incredible work at Viacom. So Action for Racial Equity, or ARE as we call it internally, was born long before we actually announced it. In the months before, our CFO and then CEO tasked us across the firm to think comprehensively about what a response to racial inequity might look like. And our team, Community Investing and Development at Citi, which focuses on how we show up in communities, convened a task force of leaders from across the firm to come up with ideas, to really think about putting that into action. We considered dozens of ideas from across the business, and ultimately we landed on those that we announced, which amounted to more than $1 billion in strategic initiatives to help close the racial wealth gap in the US. And we focused on the racial wealth gap because as a financial institution, that's kind of where we show up most effectively. And core to our approach was taking a business-focused lens on the work that we were doing. Philanthropy is a component. We see that as an important catalyst for innovation, but we really wanted to look at who we are as a company. And that shows up in the 4 pillars of our commitment: access to banking and credit in communities of color, Black entrepreneurship, affordable housing and Black homeownership, and working to become an anti-racist institution. None of this work is new for us. It builds on a long-standing focus on financial inclusion, relationships with racial justice organizations, and investments in programs that have targeted the racial wealth gap for more than a decade. But what is new is, as you highlighted in the question, honestly, the extent to which we have engaged teams across the company in an effort that's comprehensive. That's really about what we're doing with what's at our core and what we do day to day. And what we're seeing early on is immense interest. So since the initial announcement, we've expanded ARE with additional commitments from business units, additional actions that are driving this work forward. We've had a lot of early wins. Last week, we announced that a year into our 3-year commitment, we've already directed $1 billion towards efforts that are focused on the racial wealth gap. And also there is still a ton of opportunity. There are ideas that we're still getting new ideas from business units. We're working on them, and we're also continuing to identify and hear about things that business units can do that could have a meaningful impact on the racial wealth gap. So overall, we're seeing great progress, but with a lot of, excitedly, I guess, with a lot of work ahead.
You know, there's a conversation here in Washington all the time about what is the most consequential issue in America. I do believe it is closing the wealth gap. And if we do that, we address so many of the social challenges in our communities. But there's another value proposition that I guess sort of drives your work. We have a partnership with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation around this business case for racial equity. We understand the moral imperative, but there really is a business and economic case, right? Because I think your report says that our GDP grows by some $1 trillion. Can you speak to that? I mean, that's a really important outcome of addressing these inequalities.
Absolutely, and we know that because of the work that we do, we've known that. But we very luckily, Citi Research, an independent team within Citi that does research on a variety of different issues, was researching the racial wealth gap at the same time that we were thinking about how do we respond. And what they found in their research is that if we closed the racial wealth gap 20 years ago, we could have added $16 trillion to the US economy. So a missed opportunity. But more importantly, if we close it now, we could add $5 trillion to the US economy in the next 5 years. That's a huge opportunity, not just for communities of color, but for the nation as a whole. And so when we do, part of why we look at the closing the racial wealth gap as a priority for the firm, not from a philanthropic perspective, but from a business one, is exactly that. There is a business case for tackling these issues.
Yeah, yeah. You know, Crystal, you know, obviously, since the unfortunate murder of George Floyd, companies across America made announcements and pronouncements and investments. We as well at the Chamber, we convened some 6,000 business leaders and CEOs in dialogue, and that led to our equality initiative. But there's some conversation now. Was that a moment, a movement? Has the momentum sort of faded? What's your thoughts on that? And if it has faded, how do we keep this going so that it does become a movement that's impactful across America and the world, quite frankly?
Yeah, so here's what I'll say to that. We're on a journey. And in many ways, the media industry has really just started to turn the heat up and the intensity up on addressing these issues. The key is really accountability. And so the more that companies center accountability in ensuring that they are talking about and taking action on these issues, the more that it becomes a part of the business imperative, right? These are material issues no matter what industry that you're in. They're important to the viability of your organization. There are also issues that we know that stakeholders, as diverse as they are, be it employees, be it the investor community, be it clients or potential clients, it's something that's important to them. And so measurement is the key to keeping the momentum going. You hear all the time that what gets measured gets done. And that's so true. And so the more that we are able to center accountability, the more that we are able to center measurement, we should continue to see increased momentum in these areas. It's not until we do that we can be comfortable in knowing that the progress is going to continue to multiply the way that we know that it needs to.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Wayne? I mean, I think you raised a really good point about accountability, and you mentioned a number of different groups, including employees. I think one of the things that we're seeing that there is an expectation of particularly consumer-facing companies that their employees want to know where companies stand on these issues. Wayne, do you agree with that, or what are your thoughts around movement, momentum? How do you keep it going? Was it just a moment?
Absolutely, and I would echo everything that Crystal said. I think that's spot on. I think for companies that take this work seriously, then that momentum has not faded. It continues to evolve. So for Citi, that fourth pillar of our commitment, working to become an anti-racist institution, that's the center of that momentum. So more than just the specific commitments we've made, it's about continuing to look at the policies you have, your business practices, so that tackling the racial wealth gap, tackling racial inequity is part of your DNA. And that, I think, to the point of employees, requires building awareness, requires providing opportunities for employees to educate and engage employees in this work, and empowering employees and the teams across your company to take action. And so we've seen teams popping up across the firm that are putting racial equity not only in what they do, but in their titles. And that's a lot of people across the firm in different parts of the company focused on racial equity and focused on these issues, but that itself feels like a good sign of progress. Because a mandate from the top, setting the tone from the top is great. That's really important in creating this, but sustainability of this work really requires that managers and that employees at all levels feel like they own a part of this as well.
Yeah, Crystal, you made a really, I think, important point earlier. I mean, that old adage that what is measured gets done. And when we launched our Equality of Opportunity Initiative, we spent an extraordinary amount of time on researching data. And in fact, we have a whole data center called Equality of Opportunity Gaps by the Numbers. How important is data and research to drive when we think about equality in America?
I mean, it's key to everything that we do, right? It's one of the things that we wanted to make super clear with Content for Change was ensuring that it was literally backed by research, data, and insights, so that, to your point, we can show progress over time. We know that, again, we have a really rich history of delivering diverse content. However, we also know at ViacomCBS, a lot of those decisions have been made on instinct, rather than impact measurement and research. And I'll give you a prime example, Pedro Zamora and The Real World. We knew that Pedro had a deep connection with audiences. However, we didn't necessarily know what the effect of that connection was and what the quantifiable impact of that connection was. And so there's an opportunity to dig deep into the research and analysis of it all so that we can change our practices, so that we can alter our strategies, so that we can build best practices to be able to share them with the marketplace and with the industry. Media has the power to shape minds, and we know that. And so the more that we can infuse research and rigor into that process, to be able to understand how we leverage diverse storytelling to move the needle on some of these very, to your point earlier, complicated issues. We have the power to do that, and at scale and in homes in a very personal way. And so, you know, research, it's the core of what we think taking the legacy and taking it to the next level, and how we can have a unique, you know, impact in our space.
Yeah, yeah. Gwen, what's your thoughts? You know, I testified on Capitol Hill a few months back about this very issue, data, and its importance. How do you think about data? Because I think it has so many implications when used to drive decisions. How do you think about this at Citi?
Absolutely. I think, again, measurement drives your ability to understand the impact. Anecdotes are great, but real data can help you actually understand the progress that's being made. When we launched Action for Racial Equity, we did so with a big dollar amount commitment. We said $1 billion, and that was an important anchor for telling the story and making it easy for people to understand what we're trying to accomplish. It's a great headline, but it's not our primary measure of success. For the quantitative commitments within the goal, there are measurable goals that they track against to see what progress they're having. For the qualitative ones, we have a good sense of what the milestones are that demonstrate meaningful progress. Because when you're looking at policies and practices, everything isn't necessarily captured in numbers. And being transparent about that, being willing to tell people this is where we are, this is what's working, and this is also where we're not doing super well, has been a really important part of advancing this work. But for me, what we're already doing isn't the most important part. Don't get me wrong, like we have to continue to assess our process with rigor, assess what we're getting done effectively, but we made a 3-year commitment. And closing the racial wealth gap is not a 3-year effort. So what is important is understanding that there's still opportunity there. We committed earlier this month to a third-party racial equity audit, which looks at our Action for Racial Equity commitments to understand the progress, but I think most importantly, to identify potential gaps and further opportunities for teams across the bank. So we launched the commitments we have with a deep understanding of what the issues driving the racial wealth gap are. What haven't we seen? What haven't we thought about that we can still be doing? That's what that effort's really about. And so I think for me, the most important part of measurement at this stage is finding the gap between what we're doing and what we can and should still be doing.
Yeah. Crystal, I'm going to borrow your first name and ask if you had your own crystal ball, right? and if you were able to look out, say 5 years, recognizing, you know, where we're on America and where we have come from and hundreds of years in this conversation about racial equality, you know, what does success look like for your work at ViacomCBS?
Yeah, so this one's pretty straightforward. It is being able to share quantifiable progress that we have made against all of the goals and targets that have been put out there, right? So we put a ton of goals and targets out there around diversity in our writers' room, around our directors, around our suppliers and our vendors and our partners, around our own employee diversity and where we want to go in the next 2+ years. And so in 5 years, we want to be able to tell you how we did, right? And we want to be able to show the progress, to Wayne's point, the areas where we made great progress and the areas where there's opportunity. And that opportunity could be through research, it could be through partnerships, it could be through working across industries. We are all working together in this space around racial equity. And so in 5 years, we want to be able to share that progress, because for us, once we're able to get down to the narratives that actually drive impact and drive change the way that we need it as a society, we then want to open source that, right? We want to share that process with content creators across the industry. And so it's, for us, it's being able to show our report card and to have a path forward to how we want to continue the momentum in all of this work.
Yeah, thank you. What about you, Gwen? What's success look like, say 5 years out?
My boss says often that what we're doing in our team is trying to work ourselves out of a job. And 5 years is a little sooner that I'm hoping that happens. But the general idea that city will ultimately not need a unit that's focused on how we show up in communities, because that's part of every team and everything that we do every day. That's ultimately what we're hoping for. And so in 5 years, I would hope that we're closer to that our workforce, as Crystal highlighted, is more reflective of the communities that we operate in, that we've made meaningful progress against the goals that we have made, that we found where meaningful opportunities are, that we can make new ones, that we're willing to make even more ambitious commitments than the ones we've already made, and that we're seeing that across the private sector, so that other banks, other companies are willing to make the commitments that are necessary to tackle societal issues, so that this panel isn't driven by two people that work on teams that are focused on this effort, but that you can pull anyone from senior leadership in any firm and have them say, what does tackling racial inequity mean for you at your company? And they can answer that question with ease.
Yeah. I want to end with to commend you for the incredible work that you're doing. And one of the things that we see across the country is that the private sector really is leaning in and leading on addressing these issues of inequality in our country, and from many different perspectives. But I want to ask Crystal, and you and both Gwen, I guess a bit more of a rhetorical question, and that is, this is not easy work. It's very difficult. But on a very positive note, Crystal, what keeps you going? What inspires you about continuing this work at Viacom CBS? Or what do you do to have fun? I mean, I think you got to celebrate the small hits and wins and successes, to your point, along this journey, along this road to equality. So just curious about what inspires you. What do you do for fun? What keeps you in the game?
So I will say what inspires me is doing this work because my children need it. That's what inspires me, right? It's, to Gwen's point, we want to work ourselves to a point where this work is no longer needed when they enter into the workforce, or it looks a little different and the goals are a little bit more aggressive, and we're solving for different issues. And so we truly are, I believe, at an inflection point, and we have the opportunity to create sustainable change. It doesn't have to be hard, but we have to focus on it, and we have to hold our companies accountable, and we have to hold each other accountable, both with folks that are in these roles, and to Wayne's point, to folks that are not specifically charged with doing this every single day. It is our collective journey to be on. And so I think we can get there. I think we can get there in my lifetime, but I'm working to get there for sure in the lifetime of my children.
Thank you. Wayne?
When I go to work every day, the people that I engage with, seeing their passion and their commitment, people that look like me, people that don't, and knowing that we're all on this journey together, that keeps me going. I know that I'm passionate about the work. I've been in this space for a long time, and so it's personal, but being reminded on a regular basis that you're not alone, and that other people are there working on this with you and care about it as much as you do, that makes it a lot easier to do. And your question about what makes it fun, that helps too, because you know what, they're challenging issues, but being able to sit in a room and work on it and laugh about some of the ridiculous things that come up along the way, it's a lot easier to do it. It's a lot easier to do the work when you can also do that.
Well, listen, again, thank both of you. Thank you so much for joining the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation and the U.S. Chamber in this very, very important dialogue. I do believe, we do believe that it is in through this dialogue that we learn, that we create understanding. And with that learning and understanding is real action that has to take place. And you're doing it. And in as much as we've made strides in progress in America, that I believe is undeniable, but we still have miles to go before we get to that place where, as you said, we you know, amend that too, Wayne, not work ourselves out of a job, but work into another job or bigger and better and more
I like
bigger
that.
job.
Right, exactly. Much better.
But we are making progress. You know, strides we made, but miles to go to ensure that every person in America, as we always say, has an opportunity to realize his or her own American dream. Thanks to both of you for joining us in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.